Throughout the first season, we talked about the connections that we all share, the underlying theme that connected all of them. Throughout this season, it has been duality, the simultaneous nature of being one and the opposite at the same time. And I feel that nowhere encompasses this more on a human level than, ironically, a cartoon. Daria is the story of a girl named Daria Morgendorffer, a young girl who is very intelligent yet unpopular, sarcastic, and overall condescending to pretty much everyone around her. She moves into a town and goes to Lawndale High School, where she meets another person just as eccentric named Jane, her sister who is more popular and concerned about her looks, and her parents are more preoccupied with their own well-being than hers. While watching this series, we simultaneously, from a teenager and an adult perspective, we experience the world through Daria's eyes, and there seems to be an underlying theme within the series of people trying to relate to her and using their own emotions to connect with her, even though that may not necessarily be who she is. Which raises the question, what is emotional projection? At the beginning of this series, people are under the impression that Daria is depressed, or she is just a bitter, angry, upset teenager. But in reality, she isn't. She's just uncaring. She has no real opinions about the world around her because it's not worth her time. It's not worth her opinion. And honestly, it seems pointless. Everyone's going to project onto her, so why give them the satisfaction of showing how she really feels? These impressions constantly get inserted onto her and her friend Jane, so much so that it almost becomes a reoccurring gag on the show where people want to help her but don't quite understand her either. In the show, just as Daria is judged based off of how she talks, how she acts, and how calm and very cynical she can be. She sees the dumb blonde as just that, a dumb blonde. She sees the jocks as being just idiot jocks, teachers as uncaring, which most of them are. She sees her parents as uncooperative and near the brink of depression and divorce. But these same misjudgments aren't necessarily all true. Those same judgments she puts on others. These are the same assumptions that are put onto Daria, but she's projecting them outward based off of their actions, whereas everyone else are putting theirs onto her. Throughout the show, there's this concept of problem solving. In a typical teenage drama, there would be a conflict and a resolution. In Daria, there isn't really one. It's more situational. The problems are just everyday teenage problems, like who to go to the dance with, or who to hang out with, or what to do when you're bored. Things of that nature that seem insignificant, but people portray them as this big deal, as they do in a lot of sitcoms and a lot of teenage dramas, as if it's the end-all be-all, the problem that needs to be resolved. But in reality, these aren't really problems. These are just circumstances and situations, and Daria calls them for what they are. She's a proxy for us to go, is it really worth being upset over? Is it really worth being judgmental over? And the answer is usually no. Daria is either seen in one of two camps by people who watch the show. She's either very, very cynical or practical. And really, she's more both. Being a teenage girl, she doesn't quite 100% understand the world around her, and yet she still seems to be more in touch with individuals in her world than those that aren't. So in some ways, she could be seen as very practical, but in other ways, she could be seen as very cold and uncaring. This fight that she has to constantly deal with from people just assuming she is a certain way or trying to reason with her, it seems to go nowhere. People will make the assumption of who she is regardless of what she does. Daria is a proxy for so many teenage people. The show is truly ahead of its time in dealing with the subjects that it does. There's a particular episode where a person in the high school dies, And they come to realize no one really knew that person. They never spent time with them, they never hung out with them, they never really knew him. But the fact that he died, now everyone is saying how great of a person he was, how amazing he was, how genuinely kind, and how much they touched their souls and lives. And Daria points out that none of them knew him. None of them even interacted with him. Aside from him dying, they didn't know him at all. And that same feeling is something we can all relate to. She is the person who tells the truth, and everyone sees her as a cold and calculated and evil individual for even pointing out the fact that that is true. It's also Daria's way of trying to understand why everyone immediately attaches to emotion instead of reason. And in that same way, she becomes a blank slate for each of us to try to fill in the void for ourselves. Maybe how we're seen, maybe how we talk to each other. So we go back to our original question. What is emotional projection? Well, I think it's just that. It's projecting. You're taking whatever you're feeling and just putting it on a blank canvas, except instead of a canvas, it's an individual. That isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's not necessarily a good thing either. When you project, you're showing your own faults, but you're harming others by doing so. You're putting a beacon or blinding light onto something that you don't really know what's going on within. And that projection can be shot back at you. It doesn't seem practical to try to do that, but emotion very rarely is. Throughout this season, we've seen various perspectives through the lens of duality. Celebrity culture, influence, fandom, the meaning behind storytelling of historical context, as well as the influence of religion. The choice and guilt that each of us have to face as individuals, and the consequences therein. And even what it means to be alive, and what it means to take your own life. All of these trials, questions, and tribulations that we may not necessarily be comfortable with asking are questions that still linger within each of us. They're perspectives that we need to bring up to the forefront, because in order for us to thrive, we need to accept that they are a reality. Within each of us shares a separate answer, which is why I never give any. I can never answer the question because I don't have the right to see your perspective of the question. I merely pose them. You have to pose your own questions, your own answers, and ultimately make your own decisions. That's the entire premise of this show. And I hope that each and every one of you who are watching have at least been able to see one of the videos, felt differently going in than coming out. If I've at least changed one person's mind to see things in a different perspective in any way, shape, or form, then I felt that this was a success. This season was much more daunting, but much more rewarding, both emotionally and spiritually for myself. And for that, I'd like to thank you for joining me this year on our journey. Hopefully there will be more questions, there will be more subjects, maybe even some you may pose yourself. So until we meet again, my friends, just remember this. These aren't answers.
They're
Hypertheticals.